So, a warm welcome to my talk about demystifying the Spring Boot magic. So, question, who in the room is thinking he is a developer? Raise your hand, please, so that I see. Who of you actually is working with Spring Boot? A few, okay. I would love to show you certain things within Spring Boot I found out during my work, like with my customers, or I want to show you also things about here, like what you could do if you develop products, especially if you move things to cloud. So who am I? That's my name, but I want to show you some pictures about me. So that's me on the boat. You don't see me, but actually I love to sail in the mountains. So in Switzerland, I'm coming from Switzerland, we have like nice lakes where you can sail, so you have like wind after lunchtime, and it's really nice. But I also prefer to sail on the sea, so that's the other thing. So in the mountains and on the sea, that's my place to be. Then actually I do kind of lecturing, trainings and so on, because I really like that. I do this in the Spring ecosystem already like for 10 years. And that's just me here on another conference. And I'm working for a company called 42 Talents in Switzerland, and basically we do consulting, firefighting, helping people actually to get started with the Spring tools in general, right? And the other thing I love to do is actually to engage with the community. So here you see us, about 40, 50 people in the Alps, having a retreat, an unconference for 3 days where we just exchange about IT topics in general. So that's about me. So I'm really heavily involved like in the ecosystem around Spring, Java, software development in general, agile methodologies and so on. But now today I want to talk about Spring Boot and magic. And people actually usually say, oh, that's really magic, I don't get that. And the question is like, what's the magic part in there? So I have lots of pictures like this, so in between, so that you see still like there is some magic around. But the question is like, what's the magic thing? And I would love to share a few tweets with you. So Phil Webb is one of the developers around Spring Boot, maybe you heard of him, and he did in 2016 this famous tweet, and he said, why are you complaining about things you do at work or you use? And the interesting thing here is you can choose actually which one, and probably too much magic or too much boilerplate code. And he also gave me the idea about talking about this in this talk. So the interesting thing is, and he absolutely did it right, sometimes we say magic or boilerplate code, and basically it's not radio buttons, it's checkboxes. So sometimes it's like both at the same time. And then probably you heard about Josh Lang. He's like the Spring developer evangelist, and he says, well, you haven't read the docs if you talk about magic. And especially in the Spring Boot ecosystem, you need to read the documentation about the auto configuration. So that's just like the entry into the topic. So probably you should read things and then it's easier. But recently I came across another thing that, well, we as a developer, we don't like to read. So we just try things, and yes, it's actually written in the README, so it's not a big thing. So that's why I want to explain you a few things today. But before we go there, I would love to explain what is magic and what's also boilerplate code. And well, actually, magic is something you could say, it's something which happens at runtime, and you cannot explain that just by reading the code. So just like in Spring, lots of annotation and so on. What's then the difference between magic and no magic? And you could say, well, there is only one measure, and the measure would be like, how big is the surprise? Because did you expect it or not? That's the thing. So it's like in a magic thing you see in a theater. And usually, also magic in my own code is something when I violate some principles like the single responsibility principle, I think just does too much and I didn't even expect this. So that looks like magic. On the other side, we have like boilerplate code, like all the way down in our application. Lots of infrastructure code you write over and over. And that means like, oops, that's, well, boring, just copy and paste the same bugs again. It's not just code, you also would copy and paste the bugs. So the question is now, how do you differ like boilerplate code and magic? And both are actually subjective, so that means it depends on who is looking at it, and both are necessarily bad. And also what is important is actually boilerplate code is not really magic if you understand what's behind this. So again, it's subjective, so it depends on who is reading it, who is judging the whole thing. So actually it's always a little bit of both. And the problem actually is when we write the code, the magic is there when we think of we are reading the code. Usually it's not when we're writing the code, because then we understand what you're doing. But if you read somebody else's code, then actually that's the problem. So David, a friend of mine, he really said it the right way. We usually read more and debug code more than writing code. So actually that's why we are always surprised that something interesting will happen. And if we take that a step further, we could actually say magic should become knowledge, because that's an important thing. If you read about it, if you hear about it, you will learn it, and then it's not magic anymore. So it's like with the magic tricks. They are not magic anymore if you know how this works, if you know how this sleight of hand things works. So now we get into the topic. We talked about the Spring Boot things, and I will show you a lot of things, and let's hope we can like bust a few things you might call still magic. So Spring Boot, just for those who don't know about that, it's an opinionated runtime for Spring applications. And the opinions in there, they are usually also called starters, and they help you like automatically set up infrastructure you would anyway have to write. In a typical Spring Framework application, you were like copying the configuration from project to project, and in Spring Boot they basically said, well, we are gonna change this, we do like auto configuration, we can guess what your typical application looks like. So that means like Spring Boot helps you as a developer to boot up your Spring application faster, or like to create the application faster. So that's the thing about this. So the magic part actually is something called auto configuration, and the question is what's behind this? And that's really like the magic trick. And if you see like a very simple Spring Boot application, you have something like this in your class. And you can imagine that if you have just an annotation on your launcher class, that's just like the application class, which has a main method in there usually, it's just this, and everything happens automatically, and you don't know why. And if you would actually decompose the annotation, like splitting it up and have a look at the source code, you would actually see that in there usually component scan happens, configuration is there, so that's why you can write beans within this launcher class, and there is a thing called enable auto configuration. So basically this at Spring Boot application annotation tells you enable auto configuration. And if you now do this, well, the question is where this auto configuration comes from. And if you do Spring applications for a long time, you probably know like the stereotype annotation, which can be picked up by component scan. And there are plenty of them. There are even like special forms here, like controller and REST controller. They are basically the same, but one has like the advantage to like render REST documents or JSON documents out instead of just like returning a view. But basically you could scan for this annotation, and actually your Spring Boot application will create Spring Boot out of these things. So that's not the magic thing, that's something which is there already since years. But in Spring Boot, if you have like component scan, you have to follow a certain structure. And actually what they introduced was something you know from other frameworks called convention over configuration. And that's not something new. So that means you need to have like a certain structure, and in this case my launcher class has to be like in a specific package. And let's assume it's just in the app package, so you'll find everything which was annotated with a stereotype annotation below, you'll find it automatically. But if you head over to like the guides from the Spring IO website, you probably think, oh, it looks very simple, I need structure. And if I change this structure and I don't follow the convention like I did here with the stuff package, you won't find the things there. So you would have to like configure things differently. So Spring Boot is like heavily relying on conventions, and that's really different if you just use things from the Spring framework by default. So they're mixed, they're based on each other, so the Spring Boot is based on the framework, but has these conventions which makes you like more productive and starting your projects faster. Now, there is something in there which is really lovely, and I'm now going into this enable auto configuration thingy. They use something called Spring Factories Loader. And the thing is, actually, that's behind this whole starter mechanism. There is a file which is called Spring Factories in the meta-int folder, which contains all the auto configuration classes, the ones you want to have executed when the Spring Boot app starts. You will even find those Spring Factory files from the Spring frameworks in each of the starters. And you specify like the full qualified configuration class, in this case my hello auto configuration class, and then actually Spring Boot just will pick this up. And that's really handy, a handy feature, because you just need to add a starter to your Spring Boot application, and basically this configuration now gets started. What they also introduced was a specific type of annotations, as you can see here in two places. It's about the conditional annotation, because you can check, for example, if something is in a class path, like the first one, conditional class, then actually we load this thing, so only this configuration class is executed when this class is available in the class path. Or, for example, in Spring Boot, also very typically, you can override a specific configuration, and then basically sometimes if you have specified it as your own Spring Bean already, you don't want that auto configuration is like overriding things. So that's why they have this conditional on missing bean in this example. So checking if the bean is already registered, otherwise we just do this. Now there are basically plenty of these conditional annotations, and also like the other ways, like also missing conditions. And as you can see on the list, there are just like a few of those conditions behind these conditional annotations. So for example, something which is like very interesting when you run in the cloud, like you would have something like conditional on cloud, and that's like the last entry over there. So the conditional on cloud just like checks in which cloud are you running, and then you would do things differently within your application. And you know, not all the cloud platforms are doing the same thing. They don't provide you like the same services you are attached to your application. So you get like vendor-dependent configuration from the cloud platform. And for example, for you, it could mean that you need to do things differently. So you could also do this check. And as you also can see, there is quite a lot of those checks, and you could even implement them easily yourself. So that's something which is heavily built into all the starters. These conditional annotations, or like this conditional on bean or conditional on missing bean, this checks actually in both ways. So if you would maybe do that for yours, for your application, it could actually look like this. And this annotation is just used on any configuration class. So you also can do the checks there. So you could even do that on your beans, but also obviously if you write your own auto configuration, then actually you would do that as well, like there. So just like a little code for beans, checking things, configuration as we are used to within a Spring Boot application. And if you know about this, And if you need to start like writing code which is used in different places, for example, you want to write a library or a starter and so on, that's really like a feature. You should know about that. And it's actually not that hard to do. Another thing which is something which is interesting is actually configuration in general. So in the Spring Boot ecosystem, actually we have so much different ways to configure your application. And recently I had like a training, somebody said, holy shit, you have just too many options, how do you do that? So when should I use what? And he was really like confused, and it's really not that easy. But for example, if you would say, hey, I'm running actually my application in a Docker environment, so I wrap actually my Spring Boot app into a Docker container, you want to configure that thing from the outside. So there, for example, and just listed here as the second way to do this, is basically like environment variables. So the thing is, you can configure your properties for your Spring Boot app in different ways, and then you can override them from the outside. And also we will see afterwards then how the strategy will work, how you could override properties like in different environments. But here just a few ideas that you could, or which you could use like in different ways, like system properties on the command line arguments, and also even configuration server if you need this. And the thing also, when we move to cloud, it's important actually that we configure our things from the outside so we can deploy it in different places. Now Spring Boot especially introduced something, and that's just like Spring Boot, which makes life easier for you. These properties before you were like injecting via add value annotation, and now they introduced something called this add configuration properties annotation. So basically that's really a fancy thing. It's a class which will become a Spring Bean, so that means you can inject this. And in our case now with the prefix, you can specify a part of the application property file, so a part of the key there, and you could inject things into this class. And just an example from a production code we run is something that you like inject different tenants, and in our case we actually don't know how many tenants we will have up front when we do a deployment. So basically we can just like change from the configuration from the outside the number of tenants, and we are like able to dynamically work with this. And that's just an object which will be a Spring Bean. The fields will be set into this array list. As you see below, you can even specify the order, and then you will use that within your like services or in your configuration classes to get like this type safe access to the properties. Now, I was talking about like properties and ordering things, and there is actually this idea, or at least I do that always like in my applications. It should be easy to develop like on a machine, on my machine. And that's why I provide by default some properties I could override afterwards if I deploy this in different places. And as you can see here, that's just the order how you override the things. So basically it starts, when the Spring Boot app starts, then it starts at the bottom with this bootstrap property or a YAML file. It's just a different way of writing things. And then it goes to the next layer and checks, oh, is there an application properties? And that's something you always have actually in your application. Then we have the different things like environment variables, the -d parameters, command line arguments. And the funny thing would be also like dynamic reconfiguration in production. And that's something you can only achieve if you do this via configuration server and notify your Spring Boot app just to reload and get the new configuration. So you see now, things on the bottom are really unflexible because they're files, they are not changeable and so on. And then if you go up, it gets even more flexible. So like during startup of your application, or even like if it runs in the cloud, you could dynamically reconfigure your Spring Boot app. So if you know about the way how to override things, it's really easy just to like scale and create multiple instances of your applications. And let's think of you want to have like your application running on a different port because you run already on port 8080. So you can choose just like a command line argument to override this. So like lots of different ways how to configure things, and if you are aware of this, you can actually use that if you do a deployment in the cloud. Now, especially command line parameters are really useful if you do this like locally during development. And that's why I just use this example, for example, with the Spring Boot Maven plugin on top. You can pass arguments down to your Spring Boot app which starts, and if you just want to run a second instance, it's quite easy. You change port, right? Or also like for the Gradle, that's very similar to it. And the last example, if you just want to start the whole thing, just like with java-jar. Just an example for the command line arguments. Now, for example, if you go and deploy the whole thing like in a Docker environment, it's different. And this is just a part of a Docker Compose file, which just shows now, oops, the properties are written differently. And as you know, environment variables are usually uppercase, no dots in there, but lower cases. The Spring Boot actually does something, and I call that usually relax binding. So they will actually translate this value, like Spring profiles active with the underlines, to the dot notation. And for you, actually, it doesn't matter if you would say, like within your app, somewhere like add value, $ curly braces, spring.profiles.active, you would get the same value because Spring Boot translates that to this property syntax as well. So you see now it's quite powerful if you use configuration, and you can use now this hierarchy of the different ways to configure a Spring Boot just to change certain things. And now in my deployment, actually, if I move this to production, well, I would change the profile to production, and that's basically it, right? So just changing an environment, and then I'm really flexible. Just one example how this could be done. Now, also within your application, to make things more dynamic, we are using profiles, and that's also not something which is very new, but nowadays, just like you want to check, am I running in the cloud or not? So especially if you use profiles on a cloud environment, for example, like AWS, Heroku, Pivotal Cloud Foundry, you would actually get selected the cloud profile by default. So using a profile for Spring Beans in one or the other way, a profile for configuration classes actually is really handy. And there also I learned about this trick with the not, or with the exclamation mark to say not. And that's really like, so, in this case, in this example, we are like in def environment or not def environment. So that could make a difference during the development. So just different ways of configure things, and that also means like the developers need to be aware of where you deploy your app, definitely, because that's something you cannot change easily from the outside. Profiles, you can also select like in different ways, just also like as we have seen before, command line arguments. In the Maven plugin, you just pass it actually to the Maven command, or then even in a property file or in a YAML file, you could use that. Or for example, if you do it programmatically. Still like so many ways to do it, so many ways also to override things. And if you know about the hierarchy, then actually it's very easy to override this from the outside. Right. And then also like the files, when you download from StartSpring.io, the skeleton of a project, you always have like this application property file. But did you know that, for example, you could even place like the profile name in there, and you load this additionally? And that's actually also really handy. So it helps you also to say, well, I'm using additionally to the application properties, I use the def or the staging property, just also like override these things. And even the possibility like for the default, you could provide an application default property, also a YAML file, which is just in there as well, and then you override it with the one on the top. Just so many ways actually to do this, but if you know about the structure, you could use that to like make your configuration very simple. Now, just going there, showing you the last one, that's something, sometimes I love it because you can actually put like all the things in here. So that means we have like the different profiles mentioned, like def and staging. But I don't like it on the other side if you would put like production passwords in here, right? So that's not a good idea. So, but you could use the other things we just learned about. You could provide this from the outside as well. So with the 3 dashes, you basically can split your configuration in a nice way. So it depends on what you like. Also what I came across is like tabs and spaces mixing for the indentation. As you can imagine, that won't work quite well. So you are in trouble then if you do this. So as a developer, like with a Java background for more than 10 years, I don't use that actually. But still like people who know a lot of JavaScript frameworks or Ruby frameworks, they tend to actually like use the YAML files. But very similar basically like to the property files. Some things I came across is also like tools, and if you do magic, these are our tools, like, right? So we have these magic wands, and they help us, they might be our tools. Now, when we do things like really crazy in the Spring Boot environment, if I write my own starters, the question is, what's the order of my configuration class? And there also, I had to learn this. And it was really such a pain for me to like understand, oops, I can actually specify the order of the auto configuration feature. So because you add actually, like in the starters, something about JDBC, some data source stuff like an in-memory database, or for example, if you have something like JPA added, there is like a certain execution order that will work. And to specify this, actually, you need another annotation called auto configure before or after. And then you can tell which one is first and which one is afterwards. With the Spring Beans before, we had something very similar. That was called like depends on the annotation. And now this is like on a bigger scale, just like if you write like your auto configuration classes yourself. And that would lead actually to a setup which would look like this. So we get on the top like data source registered, afterwards we might get a JDBC template, and then afterwards the other thing will be like repositories where we need all these beans. So that helps us actually to create the proper order and the objects in the right way. And as you also know from Spring Boot, sometimes like configuration is overridden. So can be that if you don't specify the order correctly, things will be different. And also maybe even because of adding certain things, configuration might be forced to be initialized in an earlier stage than what you would expect. But I will show you that thing later I came across. Another feature which might be nice is something like detecting the failures you have within your application. You know stack traces. And the question is now, well, does everyone know what's going on here? There is somewhere written, could not auto-wire something, right? So, well, what was wrong? In Spring Boot, there is something called failure analyzers. And these analyzers, they just like provide you nicer feedback. And that's also something you can write on your own. And I'm guessing you have seen that already if you do a Spring Boot app, that they tell you, for example, very nicely that already, for example, port 8080 was used. So just like not letting you just like find all the stack traces, get the right thing in mind, getting the right picture, they can also help you to do this. And that means also like if you write your own code, auto configuration / starters, actually it would be nice to also have like a failure analyzer if you know there is like certain failure. And especially if you are doing this like in a way that you need to deploy like often, you would reuse this component. So if everyone else is also using your components, it's really handy to have something. Right. So now we go a step further, and also something you should be aware of. Spring Boot does fetch jars, and I guess you know that already. But the bad thing about the fetch jars is actually if you put everything into a Docker container, you're going to create like huge layers. And the layers will be usually transferred on the network when you like just deploy a new version of your application. So that means like our Spring Boot app might be like 30, 50, 80 megabytes because of the dependencies. That's always something which is in one layer if you do this. So the Spring Boot Maven plugin just creates you a fetch jar. Now, just as you see what's going on within the build phase if you do this, so you see, for example, the original jar at the bottom was like really lightweight, just like just my classes in there. But if they create the fetch jar with all the dependencies in there, you basically have a huge thing there. Now, the idea would be, especially like for a Docker environment, to add something like that we have a layer which just contains dependencies. And that's also something really special, because now you see, if you use like a specific module to create like a thin jar, you would have on the side as well a folder which is called, in this case, target thin, which contains all the libraries. So they are not packaged anymore into this thing. So that means for our Docker container, we could create like two layers, one layer which rarely changes, the ones with the libs, and the other one which changes, which actually has our business logic in there, just to create like less traffic. And that means basically you would have to additionally add some different plugins to this to actually achieve this, to create like this thin launcher. Now, there is another way, and that's even like the easier way to do. Instead of saying, yes, I need to add plugins and so on, you just can basically unzip the fetch jar. And if you unzip the fetch jar, you would have a structure which works already. So if you unzip actually your demo jar file, you would actually find folders like bootinf, metainf, and so on, and there you have actually your classes and your libraries in there. And if you copy the things properly, then actually you can make sure that, for example, the classes part at the end, if you need to create a new layer, well, or update the layer, it's probably just the one which has a few kilobytes in there. And that also means I need to start now my application a little bit different, but that's quite easy. Just provide the launcher file at the end, so you directly start the app with the main method. So yeah, that's definitely a part here. Now, a thing which is neat, and probably you heard about it or maybe you saw it, that's the actuator, which is highly configurable. And that's just something, what I do is when I like integrate my app into a system which is already there, I basically use the Micrometer API, I hook in and just create my own endpoints. And there are like plenty of endpoints already there, and I even like go and create my own one. So just because you have this infrastructure, it's quite easy actually to just like say something like, for example, I working heavily in banking. So for example, I have like endpoints which gives me information about like the core banking systems my customer run on. And just like extending such things is basically just a few annotations where you provide the endpoints. Right. So also something to have a look at, and which is really powerful, and such things we actually did in the past like on our own, but now you have it for free. You just need to know about it and how to hook in. And also now actually the actuator endpoints are based on hypermedia, so the way you should actually do REST. Now, question would be like, what do you do? How do you know what's deployed in production? And that's also something which is really handy, especially if you like deploy multiple times and you get like bug requests and you want to teach people how to know what is deployed. And there is a nice plugin which creates you like all the information from your Git repository, which just like adds like the commit, the branch, and so on, so you exactly know what's deployed in a staging environment. So that's also a thing. Now, even it goes further, and if you do development, it's not always about production. You came across probably across dev tools, which is basically something which can help you to reload Spring Boot efficiently. And it's also something which just like lets you override some standard behavior. Like for development, you don't need caching at all, but for production you do. So that means like DevTools would make sure that things are just, for example, not cached during development. And you have lots of other tools like live reload server and remote debugging enabled. So another thing, now there you could say probably, oh, that could be magic. If you use DevTools, you have to pay attention how you actually name your project. And for me, that was really magic. I couldn't even find a spot where things were explained. And for example, there is just a rule, don't call your demo project spring-boot, because things won't work with the DevTools. So you would get definitely some weird side effects. So that was like the first thing I thought, oh, that might be magic. I don't know what's going on, right? So that's just like a nice trick. Then actually I was asking a colleague, he said, hey, you have to read the documentation. It's mentioned there. And that was like the spot saying, that's the thing, don't name it like those things, so everything is fine, right? So definitely it should be documented, but also it should be properly documented, because sometimes when you read things, you don't actually get the point, and that's sometimes quite hard. But here it's like a block which was like mentioned it extra, so you don't name projects like this. Also, like, don't name it Spring Boot Actuator or Spring Boot Starter, right? So that could be something. You say, oops, I didn't know that, and they do some hard-coded things because of that. So names are used within that code, and that's why you're not allowed to do this. Now, if we dive into your application, so that things are not magical, you should know that like there is certain events going on within your application. And as you can see, like you start your application, you get an event, then logging gets initialized very at the beginning, then like your environment is created, like configuration files are read, like environment variables and so on are passed in. And you see now, that's actually the place even before all the beans are created. And it just like goes further. And now my point is actually, if you would go through this, if you would know now exactly the point where you need to change something, like for example, you want to check, is the right email server configured? You could hook in actually in these places and just like do the right thing. And for me, for example, it happened in the past that we had like a production application. Well, we had it on the test system yet, we were still developing, and we were sending out emails, and morning around 5 o'clock we realized, oops, from the test systems email were sent out to customers. And it was actually not such a nice thing. And luckily it was not the case, but then I said, oops, actually for a certain environment, I know the names of the mail server, so I actually implement a check, and I do it just in the right place because I know now where to do the things. So if you know where to hook in because you get the point with all the events and like the extension points, it's actually quite easy to like do the checks very early before you even start up your application. Now, actually things in the code in Spring Boot, they are not magic if you can read documentation or if you, for example, can read the source code. But the community is something for me which is like crazy, and that's just something I cannot explain why. So many actually Spring guys on Twitter which help you, and sometimes it's even faster than getting an answer from a colleague. And that's what I also would call, like in this case, and that would be magic. So I had an issue, and it was like, wait a second, that was not that yet. Yes, so I had an issue in the past that I didn't know about it, and I was actually using Twitter, and I'll show that to you in a second. But for example, this guy actually said, I stopped actually reading emails, and it's one of the Spring Boot developers. And the question is why? Because he makes time for tweets. So I found that lovely. And I just want to prove you the things that's really true for another guy, for a French guy, which actually did the same. I had a question, and it even didn't take like 1 hour. I got an answer for my very weird thing, which I couldn't actually explain, and I got actually nice ideas. And you probably remember auto-configure before and after. That's something I learned about that. I didn't know before. So a really nice thing. So community is something which is like crazy in the Spring Boot ecosystem. You just should use that like all the other things, also like Stack Overflow and so on. The difficult thing I usually find is it's difficult to find the right solution. If it's Spring Boot 1.5 or Spring Boot 2 or 2.1 right now, that's actually I would call it like the tragedy nowadays, because just lots of content were produced actually for the Spring Boot 1.5. So let's finish my talk. I hope I brought a little light in your life as a developer. You understood something, you probably, or I hope you took something away, and that's just the thing we covered. So like behind a lot of auto configuration, we have these features usually done with this Spring Factory loader or these Spring Factory files, which are like configuring things, conditional classes, then also how like the configurations are run, and so on. And also like lots of tools in there which are really handy to work with. You had to do before like everything on your own. Now you get it for free. And especially the last thing I want to highlight is, because before I always had to talk to the infrastructure guy. What do you need actually to run my applications better? I didn't got proper feedback, so I made my life easier. We're implementing such things to make my life in the support way better, so I could support them better. But then actually they found out this is really cool. Patrick is providing endpoints, and now it's even easier, so you can get it for free by just adding the actuator. Yes, so I'm through. Time is up. Do you have questions? So let's check the system. Yes, I do, to change the Slido. So what about Google Chip tool packaging jars to Docker? So as far as I know, Google Chip is just like the thing to create Docker containers without having a Docker daemon on your machine. So they just create like the containers binary compatible for a Docker environment. So you can easily combine those two things, right? So that's not a big deal. But still keep in mind, the layering part is like the thing you have to take care of, because that takes lots of time to transfer over the network. If you think of like deploying like thousands of instances, and then you have to like deploy like thousands of 80 megabytes of your fat jar, that's not a nice thing. But if you have like a tiny layer, that's way faster. So chip is not something you can consider automatically. You get smaller layers. You still have to like explode the fat jar and make on your own the slower, the tinier layers. Other questions? No questions? So I'll be actually at the Ask Me corner. So if you don't want to ask questions here, find me there. I will stay there for a while, and I'm happy to answer your questions, and also probably tomorrow as well. So just find me. Yeah.